So now, net zero emissions in the Midwest. We're going to kick things off as we move from the report itself into some of the value, and then how do we do this? This is the science of carbon dioxide removal, and into some perspective on this. And it begins quite simply with the question, what is the definition of net zero emissions? What is net neutrality, and how does the Midwest and Indiana in particular, how do we contribute to that goal? Serving as our moderator is Dr. Drew Wong, a materials engineer at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and the lead author of the Regional Opportunities section in the Roads Removal Report. Dr. Wong's research encompasses the analysis, development, and maturation of energy and climate technologies. He works with teams inventing new energy generation, storage, and electrochemical conversion technologies. As the regional chapter lead, he was charged with putting each of the state opportunities into perspective, identifying how regions could collaborate and work together to reach net neutrality goal. We'll welcome Dr. Wong and let the panelists introduce themselves. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I'm very excited to be here. Can we do a quick mic check? I just want to check to see.
Check.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Just so that you can all hear us. And we're going to be moving into a conversation piece. We're going to do a roundtable to talk a little bit more granularly, but still at a pretty high level of the things that we've been hearing already today. So I would like to actually give my panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. And so we'll start off. I'd like to have Jerome Dumortier, who is a professor at the O'Neill School here, and is also one of the Roads to Removal authors. So Jerome, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Jerome Dumortier, and I am a professor here at the O'Neill School since 2011. So I've been here for 13 years now. And before I was at Iowa State University for 6 years. So I have been here in the Midwest for quite a while. Basically, my research, I'm interested in land use change. I'm interested in what happens to US agriculture. I'm interested in what happens to US land. So if you're thinking back a couple of decades ago at this point, agricultural land was mostly about grain production for feed, for food. But it has evolved over the years, especially over the last, say, 10, 15 years, also into energy production. And this report kind of is a culmination of my research in terms of that it moved from energy production, but also about carbon emissions, that now we are in a situation where land in the United States can actually not only produce food and feed and energy, but it can also produce carbon benefits. So I'm very excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to this panel.
Excellent. And so next we have Sarah Beth Aubrey, who is the founder and facilitator of In Climate and the founder and principal of the Envoy Group. And I'll let her explain what those are.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And thank you for the invitation to serve on this panel today. I'm looking forward to joining my colleagues here and hearing more about what they have to say. So my role has really been that. As a facilitator, I always say I try to work to help organizations and groups facilitate progress and navigate change. So I've had a consulting firm for over 20 years. It's a certified women business enterprise at the state and federal level, and been through a variety of iterations, but agriculture is definitely my base, definitely where I've worked. And we have a consulting group today, the Envoy Group. We have 8 consultants that work for us in several core areas, from coaching leaders to content and trainings. And then we also have an important lane that we call our coalitions, or our grassroots coalitions. And that's how In Climate came to be, and part of how I believe I'm involved in the panel today. So several years ago, we started a group here in Indiana called In Climate, and that's a play on words. It was really around the idea of in, of course, IN for our guests from out of state, and then being in the climate conversation, and really recognizing that, as we've heard multiple times already today, and I know will be reiterated throughout the 2 days, agriculture has a role to play as a solution to concerns we have about climate. And so we wanted to bring that forward and start the collaboration in a more formal way throughout the state. So talk a little bit more about that work as we go through, as it's relevant to the questions, but that's where I spend a lot of my time, and appreciate the opportunity.
Excellent, thank you. And our third panelist is Courtney Kingery, who is the CEO of these 3 different organizations: the Indiana Soybean Alliance, the Indiana Corn Marketing Council, and the Indiana Corn Growers Association. Courtney, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Drew. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for including me in this conversation. I'm the CEO of those 3 organizations, and we work on behalf and to benefit the 20,000 corn and soybean farmers in Indiana. 95% of the corn and soybean farms in Indiana are family-owned. So I work on behalf of those family farmers, those family farm operations. We do work in primarily 3 areas: market development, sustainability, and value creation are 3 of the big areas we work in. And what we're seeing now is that sustainability, and we talk about sustainability in terms of the 3-legged stool, both or all 3 of environmental, economic, and social sustainability. And what we're seeing is that those 3 pieces are now coming together and are being part of market access. And we'll talk about market access and maybe some of the global markets. But really the work that the corn and soybean farmers are doing here in Indiana around that sustainability is foundational to a lot of the work we've been hearing about and will continue to hear about. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of that and what the family farmers are doing here in Indiana already.
Perfect. Now, just as a reminder, this is a conversation, and so as you listen today, I want you to be writing down questions. We'll give an opportunity for our panelists to kind of discuss some common questions, but then would love to involve you in this as well. So just be noted that there will be questions to come. But the first direct question, Sarah Beth. So you mentioned your work in climate for your members and sponsors. What is kind of the pulse of agribusiness as you think about carbon removal and emissions reduction? Can you give us an insight from your work in that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I thought about this a lot. I mean, I think that there's the answers that we want to give and we want to share, and there's also, different realities about what's going on. And so I think the first thing that I would say about the pulse when it comes to agribusiness, and I would include farms in the agribusiness sector as well, is that first of all, there's a level of awareness that's really increased. When we started in climate several years ago, we had a very basic goal. We sat in a roundtable, several peers and friends, and we literally said, what are you doing in this area? What are you doing? What's on your mind? What are your concerns? And it was the start of a collective dialogue that we had not had before. That is not to say that there weren't activities going on, as I know Courtney will address. That's not what I'm implying at all. It was that we were not as a collective really having that conversation and beginning to raise that awareness further and out into the public beyond just our supply chain and frankly within our supply chain with one another. So that was really one of the first things that I would say. And when you ask that is about what's the pulse, we've really gone through that initial phase of awareness. And that is moving now into what I would call action. And we're moving even in towards advocacy. And we'll hear a little bit more about those actions, particularly in ag from our soil carbon panel next. So we'll, as you asked us to do, we'll leave the technical questions to them, thankfully. But I think that's been an important thing. So awareness is it. Now, with growers, I think regarding emissions reduction, the debate is on a little bit. Yes, everyone understands that all industries have an emissions footprint. We all have an opportunity to make those improvements. But as you heard from the introductory speech about the report, how does this pay? How do we use this in a way that also helps these organizations, farms, and the agribusinesses that serve them? How do they do that from a legacy and sustainability standpoint? That is not fleshed out yet. And so while I know agribusiness supports the idea of emissions reductions, and I have a few examples for later in the convo today to share of what we are doing, the answer is still, how does this work for us? We are still the suppliers and protectors of the food system. And so we have to make changes, and as we do, but in a prudent, feasible way that really also aligns with our values. And so that is part of the pulse that I see today.
That's perfect. And I think it really ties in with what Courtney was saying about environmental, economic, and social aspects being really kind of core to this question of how do we do carbon dioxide removal in a responsible way. So Courtney, the question to you is, you can see agriculture from various perspectives. Some people focus just on the environmental impacts, but there are other ways that this plays in feeding the world and supporting local economies. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective of how you see agriculture activities more broadly?
Absolutely. Thank you. And when we talk about agriculture and agriculture activities, we think about the entire value chain, from production all the way through to food, feeding and fueling really the world. And so one of the things about this report, when you look at the different elements and aspects of this report, agriculture has a place in many of these. So starting off with photosynthesis, right? It starts with the plants. It starts with really carbon or CO2 destruction through photosynthesis in many ways. NASA satellites show that during the growing season here in the Midwest, it's the highest concentration of photosynthesis of anywhere in the world. So how do we make that longer? How do we increase that? How do we use things like cover crops to make that growing season longer? But cover crops don't work on every farm. They don't work on every soil type. They don't necessarily work in rotation behind every corn or every soybean. So it's not a single answer for that. When we talk about biomass, that's incredibly important as well. But when you talk to farmers about biomass, biomass isn't waste. It isn't leftovers, and it isn't free. So farmers use biomass on their field to increase nutrient content, increase moisture holding. Think of it in your flower beds at home. Maybe you put mulch down on your flower beds at home. Farmers utilize biomass that way. So when we talk about how to bring biomass into advanced production of plastics or different products, that's not something necessarily that farmers want to give up because they see value in that. We talk about geological storage and carbon capture. Oftentimes when you see that map of Indiana and it's all green, that's all under cropland, right? So that's farmers' cropland. So there's maybe a little bit of tension or a little bit of conversation around land use. Who owns pore space? Who owns that underneath that? How are farmers compensated for that pore space as it goes through that? Transportation is a big piece of this as we're talking about transportation and how there are right now solutions in ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel that are liquid fuels made from botanical sources. Right now, they can reduce the geological footprint, they reduce carbon, and they save money to consumers if they're using higher blends of renewable fuels in their fuel sources, in their vehicles, without having to buy new vehicles. When you think about electrification and electric vehicles, those are still incredibly expensive modes of transportation that not most people have access to be able to purchase. So how can we bring solutions to the table and agricultural solutions to the table in terms of biofuels to help with that? And then finally, we talk about economic and social impact. 20,000 corn and soybean farmers in Indiana, thousands of families that are doing work in this area, thousands of families every day that are getting up and making choices about how to sustainably take care of their land and feed their families. When we were looking at the map up there of some of the counties that could benefit the most, my home county, White County, Monticello, Indiana, was one of the ones that was like bright green. And I'm thinking, okay, in my family's farm, for my mother's neighbors, what can we do? And those are the decisions and the conversations we have every day. So there's a great big value chain globally, right? If you're thinking about ethanol and ethanol production here and how it can go to Canada and how it can go around the world, India's looking to make ethanol targets. So the corn that's grown here in Indiana can get sustainably produced into ethanol that can go to India to help clean up the air in India, right? When we think about these global impact, but it all comes back, it all starts with the family farm and those farming operations. So when we think about there's 2% of us that farm or involved in farming and 98% of us that get to benefit from it. So it's about looking across all those holistically.
That's awesome. I'm really excited actually to see this like very big breadth of on the ground, what does it mean for individual people, as well as what does it mean for kind of our global economies? And so, Jerome, the next question that I'd like to ask you is maybe kind of in between, what is going to have the bigger impact on farmers? Climate change policy?
Okay, so this is a very good question. I think that farmers in the Midwest or in the US in general, and also around the world, they are in the interesting position that they are affected by climate change in the sense that you have effects on yields, you may have changes in growing seasons, you have more precipitation. But on the other side, they have a huge potential to actually contribute to or being affected by climate change policy. So I think in the short run, the climate change policy is going to have a much bigger impact on farmers in the Midwest and in the United States. So I'm an economist by training. So I'm basically thinking about rational choice, if you will, in the sense that incentives and financial incentives really matter. So before we have seen that, for example, we talked about biofuel. That in 2007 there were multiple reasons why we had suddenly a growth in the corn ethanol sector, but GHG reduction or greenhouse gas reduction emissions was one of those. Corn farmers in the Midwest have tremendously benefited by this increase in the corn ethanol demand. But now with electrification, which if you think about is also a climate change policy or a response to climate change, they're now affected or they're now faced in the situation where more electric vehicles are coming, and that reduces the demand for corn ethanol. Right now, about a little bit over a third of the production of corn in the United States goes to ethanol. Now, it is clear that when you're looking at projections about electrification in the United States, that the projections vary by a large magnitude. But right now, for example, in Norway, you have about 94% of new cars that are sold that are electric. So it can go very rapidly. Courtney has mentioned this before. If you're thinking about sustainable aviation fuels that are going to be basically taking off, no pun intended here. So that is going to be a different market for corn. Again, it is going to be a climate change policy. But the big difference is now with sustainable aviation fuels. Farmers before, they didn't need to know anything about their carbon intensity score. Basically, they didn't need to know really how much carbon are they actually emitting or how much carbon are they going to store in the soil. Now, in the future, that is going to be different, that each farmer has to know of what is their carbon balance in the soil. And so there's going to be a much bigger effect of carbon policy.
Please. Oh, this is where we take it away.
So one thing you mentioned about ethanol policy and sustainable aviation fuel, I think there's a really interesting middle ground. So currently, ethanol is about 11% of all of the liquid fuels that we have. There's a really interesting middle ground to get to an E15, a 15% ethanol blend, because sustainable aviation fuel is still years and years and years away. But in a really short term, we're talking it could happen next month. I mean, it's currently available. E15 or unleaded 88 is currently available out there. Nearly every car can use it right now. And just by making that small switch to go from an E10 to an E15 can have dramatic impact on the air, air to cost. You can have clean fuel. So just making that small switch in the very short term from an E10 to an E15 can have dramatic impact in air quality. And that can happen right now while we're waiting for sustainable aviation fuel. So there's a right now situation of about E10. There's a super short term of an E15 all the way out to sustainable aviation fuel as well.
I actually wanted to pull on this a little bit and kind of draw out some of this conversation because, Jerome, I know you study electrification of vehicles, and I'm just kind of curious, what might it look like in Indiana in the next 10 years, 20 years? We have electrification, we have movement to more or higher levels of ethanol. I'm just curious, like, what do you guys think is like How does this play out? How does it affect people on the ground? How does it look for our climate policies kind of long term?
I think there are tremendous opportunities for farmers in the Midwest, in the sense that you have multiple. So I mentioned this before, that I'm interested in basically as land as an asset that can produce food, that can produce fuel, that can produce energy, and also carbon benefits. So I think in the long run we have or even in the short run we have you can think about E15. You can also think about biodiesel. I actually just got back from a biogas conference in Brussels, European Biogas Conference, where it's about using, and this is not covered in the report, where it's basically using manure from livestock to produce renewable energy. Renewable natural gas. Germany is producing renewable electricity with it. And so this is a potential that is completely untapped, or not completely untapped, but relatively low in the United States. So manure, we have plenty of hogs in the Midwest, if you will. You also have dairy farms in California that are producing a lot of manure. And all of this can be captured to produce biogas. So I think there's going to be a rapid growth in the future in the US.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that as well, and thank you for asking that. So definitely all of these things, and one other one that I would add is in the area of renewable diesel. So another opportunity for agriculture, again, emerging in some ways, not as far off as SAF, as you mentioned, but for example, I was given permission to share this today. A good friend of some of us on the stage, Country Mark is the farmer-owned cooperative in Indiana. Many of you are familiar with that. If you're from out of state, you may not be, but they plan to release their first renewable diesel, a co-processed with renewable feedstocks and diesel product in August. And so they anticipate that diesel product will come out with approximately up to 10% of renewable diesel in that product. And a couple of the things, biodiesel is one of those things that's been important to us in this state for a very long time. And there's always positives and negatives, and those who want to use negatives have always said things about, well, it's hard to start in the winter, and there's arguments over that you can make, and I'm not technical, so I won't make them, because I think that's a great opportunity for Indiana farmers. But this product evidently has the opportunity to be the opposite of that, should be something that can run in those cold temperatures they're seeing. So they are anticipating that that's going to be another one of those opportunities for farmers, along with these other three that my colleagues have just mentioned. So that will be the first project that we know of in the Midwest. So exactly, there are many things happening that will allow ag to be the solution with products that will be readily available for purchase.
It comes back to, are the policies going to be put in place, to your point, the short-term policies, in place to appropriately compensate the farmers to be able to make the production practice changes? And we know how much that is. It takes farmers about 25 cents a bushel, or about $50 an acre, for them to change a process, for them to do it. So these are known numbers, right? So any practice, anything that we want to try to incentivize, it's going to cost about that much. And you can apply those numbers to anything. If you want them to grow non-GMs, it's going to cost you about a 25 cent a premium bushel to do non-GMs. If you want them to do cover crops, it's going to cost about $50 an acre, right? So we know what that math is. If you take that math out, just for Indiana, I think I'm looking at one of my colleagues in the back of the room. We've got, what, Ed, 11 billion acres in Indiana, roughly, corn and soybeans? 11 million. There we go. So I had one too many zeros in there. So we can do that math, right, of $50 an acre of how much it's going to cost if we wanted every acre in Indiana to be incentivized with some of these. We know what that math is. So are the programs and or policies going to be in place to incentivize the farmers to do what this paper has laid out the potential is?
I think that's great. I love putting numbers on like specific things and say this is what's actionable. I do want to give the space for the audience. If there's any questions, please raise your hand and we can come around.
You've stunned him into silence.
Wow. Nope. Got one. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name's Amelia. I am a second-year MPA student at the IU Bloomington campus, here with some of the Bloomington Sustainability team, also representing the O'Neill Environmental Professional Students Association, so really happy to be here. A question I jotted down while y'all were talking. So one thing I'm hearing today is like the science communication aspect of these initiatives. And so I'm wondering, how do you foresee like facilitation of stakeholder engagement with these initiatives being proposed, as well as like all the big targets that were mentioned earlier? And also like, how do you effectively communicate that to stakeholders, particularly farmers, and show them that they have opportunity to benefit from these programs or like stake in the journey to the US net zero goals? Because as we've talked about, like these are people's way of life and backyards that we're talking about. So yeah, thank you.
I can take that as a start, and I'll leave room for you folks if I could. But you know, I'm going to take the piece that you said about the stakeholder engagement, and particularly with farmers. How and if you think about in light of this report or other work that many of you are very passionate about doing, we actually did a study in 23 within climate, and we had 250 Indiana farmers respond. And one of the question was, and this is really about messaging and how do you communicate that, and that's your question, I think. And one of the most important things is this type of information is extremely valuable and useful, but if it's not communicated to that stakeholder, the message will not be received. So just a really small example, in that study, we asked growers what language, what words they actually liked to use when talking about this topic. And it was even hard to ask the question because we had to put a name on the question, which was kind of leading the witness. So we went with conservation ag. That's a term that's been around for many of us in this room our entire life, right? That conservation ag movement, though we call it new today, it's not new, it's 40 some years old. So we used what terms do you like and not like in the conservation, to describe your conservation efforts. And the most disliked term in the list, it may not be a surprise to you, but it was carbon neutral, carbon negative, and the like. So when we take our materials and we lead with that kind of language, it's going to potentially shut off some individuals right up front. The second least favored way to describe this topic is climate smart. Yeah, and these guys agree, they know this too. They may have a different opinion, but why is that? Well, for many that sounds like a government program, which can feel a little off-putting, and it also says, alert, alert, regulations ahead. Now, sometimes that can include opportunities, financial incentives that we've been discussing and are relevant, and farmers use those. We know they do. But things like regenerative, sustainability, stewardship, those words resonate well with that farmer audience. So when you go in with that language and open that dialogue, I think you'll have more success.
Can I jump into this also about the, so again, I know that financial incentives really matter, and I mentioned before that I'm involved in a project about biogas in the United States with manure. And so what we have done is basically we think about providing financial information to in the form of a decision tool to stakeholders or to farmers, that they can actually just look at, well, if they're changing, say from a deep pit storage or lagoon to a digester, how much carbon dioxide are they actually saving? Then they can put in a value of that carbon dioxide. So for example, if you're thinking about that, there are companies that are right now or voluntary carbon programs that are paying farmers to adopt certain practices. Then it's basically the farmer can look at or the livestock producer can look at the financial implications of that, where we are trying to get away from the issue of, say, for example, using the term climate smart agriculture.
For the sake of time, we'll end the audience question portion. But one of the things, Sarah Beth, you brought up, which I thought was really cool, is the statement, the emissions debate is on. And so I wanted to give each of you 30 seconds, we'll keep it really brief, just to go down and just your concluding remarks. What does it mean that the emissions debate is on? So Jerome, can I start with you?
The emissions debate is on means that there's money in reducing emissions. There are voluntary carbon programs. There are tax credits So there are a multitude of ways, and you can think also that companies are willing to actually pay producers to reduce carbon. So there's money in it.
Perfect. Sarah Beth?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, by that, I really mean that while we recognize the importance of emissions reductions, and everyone acknowledges that, farmers acknowledge that, agribusiness acknowledge that. So there's no debate in that. But the speed, the methodology, the cost is where we have a lot of room for discussion. And so to really go about that in a measured and intelligent way that also still allows for financial profitability and sustainability for our agricultural community is important.
Great. And Courtney, you get the final word.
Yeah, so we hear that farmers need to deploy these things. And we're missing some of the conversation that farmers have been doing this for 50 years or more. When you think about no-till, strip-till, cover crops, it has been going on. And so farmers have been part of this solution. You're speaking about words. They conserve. We're getting more food, more fuel with less water, less land, and less inputs. And we can't forget how much farmers are already contributing to this when we think about what's next. We need to acknowledge that, incentivize that, and recognize the farmers who have been doing this for 50 years plus already in Indiana, and how Indiana is really leading the nation in these conservation practices.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's thank our panel.